The music hall was alive with a quiet excitement that felt almost electric. People had filled every row of seats, some leaning forward eagerly, others sitting back with calm curiosity. Cameras were set up in corners, capturing the rehearsal for a broadcast, and microphones hovered above the stage. The walls, tall and polished, reflected the soft glow of chandeliers, making the room feel larger than life. It was a place where music lived and breathed, where people came to witness performances that might change the way they thought about sound and emotion. The famous pianist moved across the stage, carrying his signature confidence. He had performed in hundreds of halls before, each one unique, each audience different, but today felt lighter, unusual in a way he could not fully explain. He had an impish idea that had been forming in his mind, one that would test both the audience and someone unexpected. There was a woman sitting quietly near the back of the hall, far from the attention of the cameras and microphones. She was not a professional performer, at least not in the public eye. She had spent years practicing in small rooms, in solitude, where no one would judge the trembling of her hands or the imperfection of her notes. Music had always been private for her, a secret world she had built to comfort herself when life felt overwhelming. The pianist's eyes found her as he moved across the stage. He noticed the way she leaned slightly forward, her eyes fixed on the piano, her fingers unconsciously tapping in rhythm with the melody he was playing. It was a natural curiosity, a quiet intensity that separated her from the casual observers around her. He smirked slightly. He had an idea, playful and mischievous, that he could not resist. It would be a harmless prank, just a little spark to add excitement to the rehearsal. He called her name from the stage, his voice calm but carrying enough authority to make people turn their heads. The room seemed to quiet further, as if sensing something unusual was about to happen. She froze, her mind catching up with the sound of her name. 1,000 thoughts ran through her head. Should she say no? Could she possibly play in front of so many people without making a fool of herself? The pianist waved her forward with a grin, insisting that it would be a light-hearted moment, just a playful addition to the rehearsal. She hesitated. The lights seemed brighter now, the audience more focused. Her stomach twisted with nerves, but something inside her urged her to move. Step by step, she walked toward the stage. Each movement felt heavy, weighted with anticipation and fear. Her hands shook slightly, not from cold but from the pressure of the moment. She had never performed in front of such a large, attentive crowd. The pianist watched, maintaining a playful expression, giving no hint that he knew what would happen next. He had seen her once before, during a brief encounter at a small music class years ago, but he did not know the depth of her talent. That was what made the prank so tempting. He could ask her to play, expecting a light, amusing failure, and yet there was a chance, a small chance, that something extraordinary might happen. As she approached the piano, she noticed the rows of faces, some smiling politely, others skeptical, a few curious. It was the first time she had felt the weight of an audience in such a tangible way. Her thoughts jumped from one worry to another. What if she struck the wrong chord? What if her fingers refused to move as they had in her private practice? What if everyone laughed? The pianist leaned toward the audience and said, "Let's see what she can do." His voice carried a mix of amusement and challenge. Some people chuckled nervously, sensing the joke in the air, while others leaned forward, curious to see what would happen. She sat down on the bench, her body tense. The polished wood of the piano reflected the stage lights, and she could see her own hands hovering above the keys. Memories of years spent practicing alone flickered through her mind. The hours of repetition, the mistakes, the quiet victories when she finally mastered a difficult passage. All of it had been private. No one had watched, no one had judged. And now, in one moment, she was being asked to open that private world to everyone. Her first touch on the keys was hesitant. The notes trembled, almost shyly, as if unsure whether they wanted to belong to the hall. She took a deep breath and tried again, focusing on the rhythm she had memorized, the flow of music she had spent countless hours perfecting. The pianist glanced at her with curiosity, his playful grin softening into something more observant. He did not yet know whether this would be a joke, a harmless laugh, or something more profound. Backstage, other musicians whispered among themselves. Some were intrigued by the unexpected turn of events. Some wondered why the pianist had chosen her. Some feared the moment would fall flat, a prank gone wrong. But others, who had noticed her dedication during quiet rehearsals, suspected that she might surprise everyone. They exchanged quiet looks, unsure whether to laugh or watch in anticipation. The woman's fingers began to move more confidently now. She had spent years learning to trust her hands, to let them carry the music even when her mind was distracted. Each note she struck reminded her of those quiet evenings alone, where mistakes were allowed, where music could breathe and expand without judgment. Slowly, the nervous tremor in her fingers began to fade, replaced by the natural rhythm she had learned to love. The audience began to sense the change as well. At first, they had leaned forward out of curiosity, expecting a light-hearted or awkward attempt. Now they leaned forward in attention. The tentative notes had become deliberate, and each sound carried emotion and intention. Faces that had been skeptical softened, and even those who had thought the prank would be amusing now sat in quiet anticipation. The pianist, too, stopped smiling. He watched closely, realizing that this was no ordinary prank. There was something genuine, something captivating in her playing that could not be planned or predicted. In that moment, the room felt different. The usual hum of murmurs and movement vanished. The air seemed to thicken with concentration, each listener holding their breath in a mixture of curiosity and wonder. The woman closed her eyes briefly, letting the music guide her. The familiar flow of notes, the rhythm she had internalized over years, now seemed to expand, filling the hall with a presence she had never imagined possible. She had not intended to impress anyone. She had only intended to play. But the moment had grown larger than her intentions. The prank that had been planned for humor was transforming into something much deeper. Every chord she struck resonated not only in the room but inside the hearts of the listeners. The pianist's mischief was slowly being overtaken by admiration and surprise. As the first few minutes passed, the woman became more aware of the audience, but not in the way that had paralyzed her at the beginning. She noticed the subtle shifts in their expressions. The tilt of a head, the tightening of hands, the widening of eyes. She felt the energy of their attention, but she did not let it control her. Instead, she allowed it to become part of the music, a silent dialogue between herself and the hall. Backstage, a few musicians were exchanging glances, whispering quietly. "I didn't expect that," one said. Another shook their head, smiling in disbelief. The story of the prank had already begun to feel like it was turning into something else, something memorable. The pianist, usually quick with words and jokes, found himself at a rare loss. He had planned a playful moment, a light-hearted interruption, but the truth unfolding in front of him was far beyond what he had imagined. The woman's breathing began to slow, her confidence growing with every note. She had entered the performance with fear and doubt, yet now she felt a quiet strength she had never experienced before. Music had always been her private world, a space of refuge and exploration, and now it was becoming something shared, something that could touch others. She realized, in a way she had never realized before, that the music was bigger than herself, bigger than the prank, bigger than anyone's expectations. The pianist's eyes glimmered with recognition. He had expected amusement, a fleeting moment of humor, and yet here was something entirely unexpected. The woman, hesitant at first, was not simply playing the piano. She was telling a story, creating an atmosphere, commanding attention, and drawing everyone into her world. For the first time in that hall, the planned prank seemed almost irrelevant, overshadowed by the beauty and sincerity of her performance. The audience began to settle into the music, forgetting the prank entirely. Even the whispers and shuffling of feet disappeared, replaced by a silence that felt almost sacred. Every person in the room, from critics to casual observers, was drawn into the unfolding story that the woman was telling through her piano. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one expected a prank anymore. The music had taken over. As the first part of her performance drew to a close, she allowed herself a small smile. The fear and doubt that had dominated her steps onto the stage had melted, replaced by an awareness of her own power and the magic of the moment. The pianist, standing slightly to the side, could not hide his admiration. The prank, he realized, had become something much more significant, something he had not foreseen. The audience, sensing the transition from ordinary to extraordinary, leaned forward, eager to see what would come next. The woman, once trembling and unsure, now played with a quiet authority, her hands moving across the keys as if the piano were an extension of herself. The prank was over in the sense that humor had no place here anymore. The stage had transformed into a place of connection, revelation, and unexpected brilliance, all unfolding in real time before the eyes of hundreds of witnesses. The applause for the first few notes faded into an almost tangible silence, the kind that makes a person feel every heartbeat in their chest. She sat at the piano, still breathing heavily, but now with a sense of focus that cut through her fear. Her hands hovered above the keys, ready to continue, but the weight of the audience's expectation pressed down on her in a way she had never felt before. This was no longer a simple prank. The pianist's mischievous grin had vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of curiosity and careful observation. He, too, was waiting to see what would happen next, unsure whether the music would falter or rise into something extraordinary. Backstage, a few musicians who had been watching from the wings whispered quietly. Some shook their heads, unable to hide the surprise on their faces. "I didn't know she could do that," one said under her breath, her voice tinged with awe. Another leaned closer, whispering, "I thought this was going to be a joke. I didn't expect." But she didn't finish the sentence because even her words seemed inadequate to capture what was unfolding. The atmosphere backstage was filled with a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and excitement. The woman's mind was a storm of thoughts. Yet beneath the chaos there was a clarity she hadn't known she could reach. Every note she had practiced for years was now alive under her fingers. Each chord carried the echoes of late nights spent alone, repeating difficult passages until they felt natural, until her fingers could find them even in darkness. She remembered the frustration of mistakes, the small victories when her fingers finally obeyed her will. She remembered how music had been her companion during lonely nights, and how it had been a quiet escape from the noise of the world. Now, for the first time, it had become a bridge between her private world and the hundreds of people sitting before her. Her fingers began to move more confidently. Each note became bolder, more certain. She could feel the flow of music moving through her, a current she did not have to control. She realized, with a strange mix of relief and wonder, that she was no longer playing alone. The room seemed to be holding its breath, leaning closer to every movement of her hands, waiting for each sound to unfold. The prank had given her the stage, but the music had taken over. The pianist watched from the side of the stage, his eyes wide, a mix of admiration and surprise on his face. He had expected laughter, maybe a few clumsy notes that would produce polite applause. Instead, he was seeing something he had rarely witnessed, even in the greatest performers he had met. There was a raw honesty to her playing, a sincerity that could not be taught. It was as if every note was a piece of her soul laid bare, and the audience could feel it. Some audience members shifted in their seats, leaning forward to catch every sound. A few critics, initially skeptical, began to scribble notes in their pads, their expressions softening. Their pens moved almost automatically, capturing not just the technical execution but the emotion that poured from her fingertips. Even the casual attendees, those who had come simply to watch a famous pianist perform, found themselves captivated. They were no longer observers of a prank. They were witnesses to a transformation, a private talent revealing itself in the most public way possible. Despite her growing confidence, the woman was aware of every subtle sound, every nuance. She could hear the echo of the piano in the hall, the slight shifting of the audience, the barely audible intake of breath when a note lingered longer than expected. Each detail mattered. She was no longer merely playing the music. She was shaping the atmosphere, guiding the emotions of everyone in the room without saying a single word. It was a strange and thrilling power, one she had only ever dreamed of experiencing. Her mind flashed briefly to the prank itself. The pianist had invited her as a joke, something to surprise the audience and perhaps entertain them at her expense. The thought made her smile faintly. He had no idea what he had unleashed. What he had imagined would be a few awkward moments had instead become a moment of truth, a revelation of hidden skill and unspoken emotion. She could almost hear him thinking, trying to reconcile the playful challenge he had issued with the extraordinary music now filling the hall. The audience continued to watch, some with their mouths slightly open, others sitting so still that it seemed they were afraid to break the spell. Every note that left the piano carried meaning. Every chord resonated deeper than she could have imagined. It was a rare moment when the boundary between performer and listener seemed to disappear. People were not just hearing the music, they were experiencing it, living it, breathing it. The prank had unintentionally created a shared space of wonder. She noticed a few subtle movements among the audience. A hand rested lightly on a chin, eyes narrowed in concentration. Another person leaned forward, clutching the edge of their seat as if holding on to the music itself. The reactions were small, human, personal, yet they told a story larger than any individual. She felt connected to everyone without speaking, without making eye contact. The music had become the language that linked them all. Backstage, whispers continued, but now they were tinged with admiration rather than disbelief. The musicians who had doubted her began to watch with a new respect. They noticed the precision of her fingers, the care with which she approached each passage, and the way she allowed the music to breathe instead of forcing it. The initial idea of a prank had long vanished from their minds. It was no longer a question of humor or failure. It was a moment of discovery, a performance that defied expectations. The woman's own thoughts began to settle as well. She realized that fear had not disappeared entirely, but it had been transformed into focus. She felt her heartbeat in rhythm with the music, her breathing aligning with the rise and fall of each chord. There was no space for doubt now. There was only the moment, only the music. Every hesitation that had plagued her before stepping on stage had been replaced by trust. In herself, in her hands, and in the power of the music she had long kept secret. As she continued, the hall seemed to shift. The atmosphere became almost tangible, heavy with concentration yet light with emotion. People were leaning in, holding their breath at times, smiling softly at others, eyes glistening without any apparent reason. The connection between performer and audience was undeniable. The prank had unintentionally created a moment of profound intimacy. The pianist remained on the side, silent for the first time in the rehearsal. He had expected amusement and polite laughter, and now he watched in awe as the woman he had called forward transformed the stage. Her fingers danced across the keys, precise yet fluid, controlled yet free. Each note felt deliberate, each pause meaningful. The prank had become a showcase of vulnerability, skill, and courage. He could feel the energy shift in the room, the collective admiration growing with every passing second. She felt a sudden surge of confidence, not arrogance, but a quiet certainty. The audience had been skeptical at first, and perhaps some had been amused by the idea of the prank, but they were no longer focused on the setup. They were entirely absorbed in her playing. Every note that resonated through the hall seemed to carry a message. That talent can emerge anywhere, that courage can appear when least expected, and that beauty often comes from the places people least anticipate. Even as she played, she became aware of herself in a new way. She noticed the subtle expressions of the pianist, the gentle nods, the faint widening of his eyes. He had thrown a challenge without expecting an answer, yet here it was, answered in the most extraordinary manner. She realized that she was not just performing for herself anymore. She was performing for every person in the room who had come with expectations, whether they knew it or not. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the future, to the possibilities that might now open. She had always dreamed of sharing her music, but fear had kept her private. Now, she understood that the world could respond to honesty and dedication, that hidden talent could be recognized in the most unexpected moments. It was a revelation she had never anticipated, all sparked by what was meant to be a playful joke. The audience, completely absorbed, barely moved. There were no whispered comments, no polite coughing, no shifting in chairs. The room was a single organism, focused entirely on the piano, on her hands, on the story the music was telling. Even the subtle dynamics, the quietest notes and the most forceful chords, were noticed, appreciated, and felt. It was a rare moment of complete attention, one that performers spend years hoping to achieve. She felt the power of the room, but it was not intimidating. Instead, it was empowering. Each note she played confirmed her presence, her voice, and her talent. The prank had given her the stage, but the music had given her agency, confidence, and the knowledge that she could meet expectations, even when they had been imagined by someone else. She smiled faintly, not at the audience, but at the realization that fear could be transformed into something beautiful. As the performance continued, she felt a sense of flow she had only ever experienced alone. The music was no longer just a series of notes. It was a living conversation, a story shared between her, the piano, and everyone listening. The prank that had brought her here had faded into the background, replaced by an awareness of her own ability, her own courage, and the extraordinary moment unfolding before her eyes. The music seemed to grow with every passing second, filling the hall in a way that felt almost alive. The woman's fingers moved with increasing confidence, each note resonating deep in the hearts of the audience. She could feel the energy of the room pressing gently against her, not in a way that made her anxious, but in a way that connected her to every person listening. It was as if each note carried a thread that linked her to the listeners, a silent conversation that needed no words. The prank that had brought her to the stage now felt distant, irrelevant, almost laughable in comparison to the reality unfolding. Her eyes occasionally flicked toward the pianist. He was no longer smirking or playful. He stood silently, watching her with wide eyes and an expression that balanced admiration with disbelief. The joke he had intended had turned into a revelation. Every once in a while, he leaned slightly forward, as if trying to catch something delicate that might escape unnoticed. He had played in front of countless audiences, taught countless students, and yet he felt a rare sense of awe that he could not shake. He had always enjoyed surprises, but this was different. This was not a trick, not a prank. This was something honest, something real, and it had the power to leave people changed. The woman, meanwhile, had started to forget entirely about her fear. The moment had taken her over, and she had surrendered herself to the flow of the music. Her hands moved across the keys with a combination of precision and emotion, creating sounds that were both exact and living. She remembered every quiet night she had spent alone, practicing until her fingers ached, correcting mistakes that no one else would ever see. Now, all those private struggles were being revealed in a way that transformed them into beauty. The audience could feel it, though they could not explain why. In the seats, people were beginning to whisper to themselves quietly, not to break the magic, but to acknowledge it. A few critics, initially skeptical, lowered their pens for a moment to simply listen. Their eyes softened, and some unconsciously leaned closer to the stage. They were used to judging, to evaluating performances against strict standards, but here, standards felt almost irrelevant. The music had created a space where only presence, honesty, and skill mattered. Even those who came expecting amusement or distraction were caught, unprepared for the depth and intensity of what they were hearing. Backstage, the murmurs continued among the musicians. The prank had been their topic of conversation moments earlier, and now it had vanished from their minds completely. "I can't believe it," someone whispered, shaking her head. Another added, "She's turning it into something I never thought possible." Their voices were low, almost reverent, as though speaking too loudly would disturb the delicate moment. The woman's talent, which had been hidden in quiet practice rooms and private hours, was suddenly undeniable. The prank had been the spark, but the fire belonged entirely to her. The woman herself was aware of the change, though she didn't stop to analyze it. She simply let it happen. Her breathing had slowed, her pulse settled, and her thoughts had aligned with the rhythm of the music. She had always known the piano could speak, could convey what words could not, but now she felt it in a new way. Each chord she struck, each note she held, seemed to ripple outward, touching every person in the hall in a subtle yet powerful manner. The prank that had started her on the stage now seemed almost irrelevant. The music itself had taken control. She noticed the subtle reactions in the audience. One person tilted their head slightly, eyes closed, absorbing the vibrations of the piano. Another pressed a hand to their chest, as if the music had reached inside them and awakened something long forgotten. A child in the front row sat perfectly still, mesmerized, unable to tear their gaze from the moving hands. The collective attention was intense, almost sacred, and yet it did not frighten her. Instead, it fueled her, pushed her to play with more care, more emotion, more honesty. Every once in a while, her mind wandered to the prank itself, the playful setup that had brought her here. She smiled faintly to herself. The pianist had expected humor, perhaps a small blunder or two, maybe a moment of awkwardness to amuse the audience. Instead, he had unleashed something he could not have predicted. She had transformed what was meant to be light-hearted into something profound, something that would be remembered long after the hall emptied. The prank had been the doorway, but the performance itself was the journey. The pianist stepped a little closer, unable to resist watching her hands in detail. Every movement was intentional. Every chord carried subtle emotion. He had seen great performers before, musicians who could charm an audience with technique alone. But this was different. This was music that spoke without pride, without pretense, without the need for applause. It spoke because it had to, because it existed, and everyone in the room could feel its sincerity. He realized he had underestimated the woman's potential, and he felt a strange pride mixed with his earlier mischief. The woman's confidence grew as she noticed the audience's engagement. She didn't need their approval, but it mattered because it was not forced, not superficial. They were listening, truly listening. That awareness gave her hands a lighter touch, a subtle elegance that came naturally, like breathing. The flow of the music became seamless, each phrase blending into the next without interruption, without hesitation. It was no longer just a recital of notes. It was a story unfolding in real time, a conversation between her and every person present. Backstage, whispers shifted from disbelief to admiration. Some musicians could not help but watch, their eyes wide. Others exchanged quiet glances that said everything without words. The prank that had seemed so trivial, so inconsequential, had grown into a display of skill, courage, and honesty that none of them could ignore. Some of them felt a stirring of envy, not malicious, but the kind that arises when someone unexpectedly surpasses expectations. The performance was a reminder that talent could remain hidden until the perfect moment arrived. And when it did, it could shine brighter than anyone imagined. She began to feel the full impact of the moment herself. Every note, every chord, every pause resonated not only through the hall but through her body and mind. She felt alive in a way that went beyond excitement or nervousness. She felt connected, not only to the audience but to something larger than herself. Music had always been her refuge, her private sanctuary, and now it had become a bridge, linking her inner world to the world outside. The prank had given her the stage, but the music had given her power. The pianist could no longer mask his astonishment. He had planned to amuse, to test, perhaps to tease, but now he was witnessing something rare, something extraordinary. He realized that he had been given the privilege of watching a private talent bloom into a public marvel, and he could feel the electricity in the room changing as the audience absorbed the beauty of the moment. For the first time, the prank felt secondary. What mattered now was the woman, her music, and the undeniable emotion it carried. The audience leaned forward almost instinctively, drawn to the unfolding story. Even those who had been skeptical, expecting a joke, were now completely absorbed. Some unconsciously held their breath during delicate passages. Others closed their eyes, allowing the sound to wash over them. Each person seemed to have their own private experience while sharing in a collective wonder. The prank had created an opening, but the music had created intimacy. She noticed tiny details in the audience, small signs that her music was touching them. A man's shoulders relaxed, a woman's lips curved into a soft smile, a child's eyes glimmered with unspoken excitement. Every reaction, subtle or not, reaffirmed that the music was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the hall, to everyone listening, and to her in a way that felt profoundly liberating. The prank had given her entry, but the performance had given her ownership, control, and connection. As she continued, her focus sharpened further. Her fingers flew over the keys with grace, precision, and feeling. She allowed herself to forget the fear that had gripped her before she stepped onto the stage. Now, she only felt the music, the rhythm, and the energy of the audience. The prank that had brought her here now seemed almost irrelevant. It had served its purpose, but the real story was being written in the sound waves moving through the hall. The pianist, standing to the side, could no longer hide his admiration. He had thought he was in control of the moment, that he had orchestrated a small joke for entertainment. Instead, he had unleashed something beyond his expectation. He watched closely, every subtle shift in her technique, every delicate phrasing, every pause that allowed the music to breathe. He realized he had underestimated her completely, and the realization left him humbled, yet exhilarated. Backstage, the whispers continued, now filled with awe rather than skepticism. Musicians who had expected a brief moment of amusement were now watching one of the most compelling performances they had ever witnessed. Some quietly shook their heads, almost as if to dispel the disbelief. Others simply sat in silent wonder, unable to articulate what they were seeing but feeling it deeply. The prank had been the beginning, but the music had become the revelation. Her hands moved faster now, not out of nervousness but because the story demanded it. The crescendo approached, building naturally from the previous passages, each note layered with care and intention. She felt her heart synchronize with the rhythm of the music, her mind fully attuned to the moment. Every sound that left the piano carried weight, significance, and a sense of completeness that went beyond her expectations. The prank was long forgotten by everyone except perhaps the pianist, who now smiled quietly, realizing he had created a stage for something truly extraordinary. The music had grown louder, richer, more commanding, yet it was also softer in its delicate moments, as if breathing alongside the audience. Each note seemed to carry emotion, weight, and a kind of honesty that made people lean forward in their seats, holding their breath. The woman's fingers danced across the keys with a mix of precision and freedom that was mesmerizing. She was no longer aware of the prank that had brought her to the stage, nor the nervousness that had filled her chest at the beginning. She was fully immersed in the music, letting it guide her, letting it speak for her. The audience was completely silent, and the silence itself felt alive. There was no shuffling of feet, no whispering, no coughing. Even the smallest sound seemed to belong to the music. Faces that had once been skeptical were now fixed on her, open and absorbed. Some people had their eyes closed, letting the notes wash over them as if they were waves, carrying them somewhere beyond the walls of the hall. Others watched every subtle movement of her hands, fascinated by the way she could make the piano sing in ways that were unexpected yet perfect. Backstage, the whispers had died down completely. Musicians who had been skeptical of the prank were now staring in amazement, unable to turn away. The sound had filled the entire space, and even from the wings, the depth of her playing was undeniable. Some of them had played with talented pianists before, but what they were witnessing now felt different. There was honesty in every note, a vulnerability that made the music human in a way few performances ever achieved. The prank had been meant to amuse, yet it had created something far more profound, a moment of real connection, witnessed by everyone in the hall. The pianist himself could barely hide the mixture of surprise and admiration on his face. He had expected amusement, perhaps a few clumsy notes to bring a smile to the audience, but this was not a joke. The woman on stage had transformed the prank into an experience that was moving, beautiful, and deeply personal. He watched her hands with fascination, noticing how effortlessly she moved from delicate, almost whispering notes, to powerful, resonant chords that shook the air. Every nuance, every subtle shift in timing, seemed intentional, as if she were speaking directly to every person present. The woman felt a strange kind of clarity as she played. She could sense the audience responding without needing to see them, without needing them to applaud or react. Their attention was a quiet force, a kind of energy that moved through the room and back to her hands, fueling her playing. The music was no longer just sound. It was a dialogue, a shared moment that included everyone in the hall without a single word spoken. She felt connected in a way she had never imagined, as if the piano and the room and the people had become a single organism, breathing together. As she approached a particularly complex passage, she felt her pulse quicken slightly, not with fear but with excitement. The notes were challenging, intricate, demanding both precision and feeling. Yet she did not hesitate. Her hands flew over the keys with a fluidity that made the complexity appear effortless. The audience seemed to sense it too. A few leaned closer, as if wanting to be even nearer to the source of the music. Others closed their eyes, letting the emotion of the moment settle in their hearts. Every person in the room was caught in the spell, and the prank that had started the whole thing was forgotten. Her mind drifted briefly to the private hours she had spent practicing, the nights alone with nothing but the piano and the sound of her own mistakes. She remembered the frustration, the self-doubt, the moments when she wanted to give up but kept returning to the music anyway. All of those experiences were now being shared, quietly, through every note she struck. She realized that every tiny struggle she had faced in private had prepared her for this moment. What had begun as a prank had become a stage for her true talent, a moment of revelation that no one would forget. The audience remained silent, yet their presence was palpable. Some had tears glistening in their eyes, barely visible in the soft glow of the chandeliers. Others held their hands lightly together, gripping the edges of their seats as though afraid to break the spell. Every individual seemed to have their own reaction, yet all were united in attention and awe. The room itself seemed to hum with the energy of collective admiration. The music had created a bridge between performer and listener, a shared experience that transcended expectation and surpassed the joke that had begun it all. Backstage, a few musicians exchanged quiet looks. "I've never seen anything like this," whispered one. Another nodded, unable to form words. The prank that had initially seemed trivial had dissolved entirely, replaced by something unforgettable. They watched with awe, understanding that the woman on stage was performing not for approval or applause, but because the music demanded it. It was honesty, vulnerability, and brilliance all at once. The woman began to play a section that was slower, more reflective. The notes hung in the air longer now, each one carrying emotion, tension, and beauty. She could sense the audience leaning in closer, feeling every pause, every subtle inflection. The pianist on the side of the stage caught his breath slightly, realizing that this was not just a performance. It was a moment that would stay with everyone in the room for a long time. The prank had only started the evening. The music had created the true impact. Her fingers moved across the keys almost effortlessly now, the music flowing naturally, guided by instinct, memory, and emotion. She felt as if the piano were an extension of herself, her emotions transforming into sound. The hall had become a single entity, breathing with her, responding to her, giving energy back to her hands. She had never experienced this before in public. The music was alive and so was she. As she reached a particularly powerful crescendo, the audience collectively inhaled, as if holding their breath along with the rising notes. The sound filled the room, reverberating against the polished walls, washing over every listener in waves of emotion. The pianist watched in stunned silence, realizing that his prank had created a stage for a performance that could move people in ways words could never capture. What had started as humor had become something far greater: art, honesty, and shared humanity. The softer passages that followed were just as powerful in a different way. Each delicate note was intentional, precise, and filled with emotion. The woman allowed herself a slight smile as she felt the connection deepen. She could sense the audience's rapt attention, their shared experience, their quiet admiration. For a moment, the room was suspended in time, held together by nothing but music and the sincerity behind it. The prank had given her entry to the stage, but the music had given her presence, power, and influence over the hearts of everyone watching. The audience reacted subtly but unmistakably. Some tilted their heads, eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music. Others allowed small smiles to form, lips quivering slightly as the emotion carried through them. A few people whispered softly, unable to restrain their awe, though their voices were swallowed by the reverent silence of the hall. The music had captured them all, and they responded in kind, not with applause yet, but with their full attention and focus. Backstage, the musicians were silent, their earlier anticipation replaced by astonishment. The prank, once the center of attention, had vanished completely. What mattered now was the woman, her hands, and the music flowing from them. Even those who had initially doubted her could not help but admire the skill, the vulnerability, and the raw emotion she poured into every note. It was clear that this performance would be remembered long after the hall emptied, a rare moment of true artistry and connection. The pianist finally spoke, quietly, to himself more than anyone else. "I did not expect this," he murmured, almost in disbelief. He had thought the prank would produce light amusement, a funny story, maybe a polite laugh. Instead, he was witnessing a performance that was moving, honest, and unforgettable. Every note the woman played seemed to carry meaning beyond the music itself, touching hearts in ways he had not anticipated. He realized that he had unknowingly created a moment where someone's hidden talent could shine, and he felt a quiet pride mixed with awe. The woman's hands moved gracefully across the keys as she approached the final passage of this section. She allowed herself to feel the music fully, to let every emotion guide her fingers. She had never felt such freedom in a public performance before. Fear and doubt were gone, replaced by trust in her ability and the music itself. The prank had been a stepping stone, a gentle push onto the stage, but the true moment belonged to her, and to the music she was sharing with the audience. The audience's attention was total. There were no distractions, no glances at phones, no idle whispers. Every person in the room was connected to the moment, absorbed by the flow of sound and emotion. Some had tears in their eyes. Others had their hands lightly resting on their hearts, feeling each note resonate within them. The hall itself seemed to hold its breath, the polished walls reflecting not just sound, but the shared energy of everyone present. The prank had given them a moment of surprise, but this was something far greater. As the section drew to a close, she let the final notes linger, delicate and purposeful. They floated in the air, and for a moment, no one moved, as if afraid to break the fragile beauty of the moment. The pianist's expression softened. He had seen many great performances in his life, but rarely had he witnessed something that felt both so intimate and so expansive, so human and so pure. The woman had taken a prank and turned it into a display of artistry that left everyone stunned, completely engaged, and emotionally moved. The final notes of the performance hung in the air like a delicate whisper, fading slowly, leaving a silence so heavy it felt almost sacred. The woman's fingers lingered briefly above the keys before she finally pulled her hands back, her body releasing the tension that had built throughout the performance. She sat there for a moment, absorbing the weight of the room's attention, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of her own heartbeat. What had started as a prank, a joke to amuse the audience, had transformed into something far greater. She felt a strange mix of relief, exhilaration, and quiet pride. The audience sat still for several seconds, as if the music had held them suspended in time. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly at first, a hand clapped. It was soft, gentle, almost as if testing the waters. Another hand joined, and then another. The applause grew steadily, swelling into a thunderous wave that filled the entire hall. People rose to their feet, some clapping with both hands, others wiping away tears that had formed during the performance. The sound was overwhelming, not just in volume but in emotion. It was recognition, appreciation, and amazement all at once. The woman stood slowly, still taking in the reaction. Her legs felt weak, trembling slightly from the intensity of the moment. She had faced fear, nerves, and doubt. And now she was receiving something she had never experienced before: public acknowledgement of her talent. The prank that had pushed her onto the stage had done its job in a way she could never have imagined. What had been intended as humor had given her an opportunity to shine, and she had seized it fully. The pianist finally stepped forward, his expression a mixture of amazement and pride. He approached her quietly, careful not to disturb the audience's lingering awe. For the first time that evening, he spoke directly to her, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. "I underestimated you," he said. "I thought this would be a joke. I had no idea." He trailed off, realizing that words were insufficient. What she had done went beyond expectation or explanation. His playful plan had unintentionally become a platform for someone to reveal their true brilliance, and he was both humbled and thrilled to witness it. Backstage, the other musicians were equally stunned. Some leaned against the walls, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged quiet glances, nodding as though acknowledging something rare and extraordinary. The prank was long forgotten, replaced by admiration, respect, and awe. They had seen performers before, talented and practiced, but rarely had anyone transformed a moment so completely, turning nervous energy into art and a joke into a revelation. The woman's own mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief mingled with excitement, and a quiet satisfaction settled over her. She had done more than just play the piano. She had shared a piece of herself. The private hours spent practicing, the long nights alone with the music, the frustration, the small victories, they had all led to this moment. She realized that talent, dedication, and courage could not only survive in private, but could flourish under the pressure of an audience, even one expecting a prank. The applause continued, a steady and unbroken wave. Some audience members were shouting encouragement, calling out their appreciation. Others remained quiet, their faces reflecting awe and emotional resonance. The room itself seemed transformed, the energy charged with the collective recognition of what had just occurred. What had begun as a simple joke now belonged to everyone present. The prank had given her entry, but the performance had given her presence, power, and connection. The pianist stepped closer, offering a respectful bow to her. She returned it with a small, humble nod. He could see the mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration on her face, the lingering trace of nerves replaced by confidence. He had expected light amusement, perhaps a fleeting moment of entertainment, and instead he had witnessed the birth of something rare and extraordinary. His initial mischief had given the world a glimpse of her talent, and he could not hide his admiration. The woman began to step away from the piano, but she did not rush. Each movement was deliberate, graceful, and composed, reflecting the inner strength she had discovered through the performance. She allowed herself a small, private smile, realizing that she had faced fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and emerged not just intact, but transformed. The audience continued to clap, rising to their feet in waves of appreciation, their energy almost tangible. The hall itself seemed alive with recognition and awe, a living reminder of the unexpected beauty that could emerge from courage. Even the critics, who had initially doubted her ability, were moved. Some sat quietly, nodding slowly, acknowledging her skill and the emotional depth of her performance. Others were scribbling notes, perhaps attempting to capture the ineffable quality of the moment. The prank, which had seemed so trivial at first, had given birth to a story that would be told and retold, a performance remembered not just for its technical precision, but for its honesty, vulnerability, and impact. The woman felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had been given an opportunity, unexpected and unusual, and she had risen to meet it. The prank had been a nudge, a playful challenge, but the music had demanded everything else. She had surrendered herself to it fully, and in doing so had connected with every person in the hall. That connection, the shared experience of beauty and emotion, was something she had never anticipated but would never forget. The pianist quietly motioned for the audience to continue their applause, giving the woman the space to acknowledge it. She waved gently, a humble gesture of appreciation. Her eyes met a few in the front rows, catching glimpses of emotional faces, some wet with tears, others wide with amazement. She realized, fully, that the prank had revealed far more than anyone could have anticipated. It had revealed her courage, her skill, and the quiet power of her talent. As the applause continued to swell, she felt a sense of completeness, a realization that the music had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had bridged a gap between private and public, fear and confidence, uncertainty and self-assurance. The prank had been the doorway, but the performance had been the transformation. Every person in the hall had been touched by something real, something beautiful, and she had been the conduit. Backstage, the musicians and staff began to stir, some clapping quietly, others simply watching in awe. They had all witnessed something rare. The unexpected emergence of talent, courage, and artistry under pressure. The prank had been the catalyst, but what unfolded was a display of authenticity that could not be replicated. It was not just a performance. It was a statement, a reminder of the human potential that often lies hidden until the right moment arrives. The woman stepped away from the piano and toward the side of the stage, still soaking in the applause. Her chest rose and fell with a sense of accomplishment she had never known. Fear, hesitation, and doubt had been replaced by confidence, self-assurance, and a deep, quiet pride. She realized that the prank had been a gift in disguise, a playful challenge that gave her the chance to reveal her abilities fully and honestly. The pianist approached again, smiling quietly. He extended his hand, not in jest but in respect. She shook it, and the gesture spoke volumes. What had started as a joke had become something neither of them could have predicted. A performance that touched hearts, inspired awe, and celebrated human courage and talent. The audience slowly began to settle, some still clapping, some rising to leave, but all carrying the impact of the moment with them. Conversations whispered through the hall as people shared their astonishment. They spoke of the unexpected brilliance, the depth of emotion, and the honesty of the performance. The prank had been forgotten entirely. What remained was the story of someone stepping forward, facing fear, and giving the world a glimpse of something extraordinary. The woman finally walked off the stage, exhausted but exhilarated. Every step felt light, despite the weight of the experience. She had taken a prank and transformed it into a defining moment, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The audience's cheers and applause followed her as she disappeared behind the curtain, a reminder that courage, skill, and authenticity can create something unforgettable, even from the most unexpected beginnings. Backstage, the musicians and staff were still buzzing with quiet excitement. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered to each other about the talent they had witnessed. The pianist stood quietly, reflecting on the unexpected turn of events. His playful plan had become a stage for a transformative experience, one that would be remembered by everyone who had been present. The woman, now off stage, allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline ebb from her body. She realized, fully, that she had grown in ways she could not have imagined. The prank had pushed her forward, the music had guided her, and the audience had embraced her. She had faced fear and uncertainty and had come out the other side stronger, more confident, and profoundly connected to herself and others. She smiled quietly to herself, knowing that this moment would stay with her forever. It had been unexpected, unplanned, and perhaps a little mischievous in its beginnings, but it had led to something greater than she could have ever anticipated. What started as a simple prank had ended in beauty, connection, and recognition. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary moments come from the most unlikely beginnings. The applause gradually faded, leaving the hall in a soft, contented hum. The audience lingered, savoring the memory of what had just happened. The woman had given them more than music. She had given them a story of courage, talent, and the unexpected power of stepping forward when called, even under unusual circumstances. The prank was gone, but the impact remained, echoing long after the hall emptied. She took one final glance back at the stage, a quiet smile playing on her lips. She had been nervous, hesitant, and unsure, but she had risen to the occasion. The prank had been the start, the music had been the journey, and the audience had witnessed something unforgettable. That night, she learned something she had never known before. That talent, courage, and honesty could shine in even the most surprising moments, leaving the world not just entertained, but moved, inspired, and amazed.